Hi, I'm Jack Finn, author of Wilson, and welcome to One Final Twist.
Jack, I'm super excited to get to talk to you. So, Wilson was my first book with you, but in doing the deep dive to get ready, I'm finding out so many more things about you. But I, but so let's get the Wilson part out of the way. Tell us about Wilson so that readers know what they're getting into and why they need to pick this up.
So, Wilson is kind of a dream killer themed carnival horror. He's actually based upon a real person I met once, so we could talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, he's a serial killer living in a 1940s traveling carnival, and he has a camera that enables him to go into the dreams of people that he takes certain pictures of, and Uh, that's kind of where the story starts, and it has a very different kind of ending than a lot of my other stories, I think.
So and I know we've talked a little bit about it, and I know you have a camera that's you've kind of based this on, right? So
I do.
tell me about the camera and how did you find that?
So one of the things, whenever I'm writing, I love the research part of writing, and I come up with the initial story itself, and as I start to build out the bones of it, I'll do a lot of research into like, does this story make sense in the time period? And as I look into different aspects, it kind of gives more texture to the story. For example, and I'll show you here. So I was looking for what would be an appropriate camera for that time period. Is it realistic? In my mind, you kind of picture those ones that was accordion style. But actually, what would have if the camera started in the 1880s, like where the story kind of where that the camera story starts, it would have looked very different than cameras in the 1940s. So I wound up looking back and I hunted down a Brownie camera, which is one of Kodak's first cameras. It looks like a box. I've actually
Mhm.
got it here. And this is actually the model itself, so I could see how it would work, how he would operate it. Track down the original operating manual for the camera to see how it would work. And that kind of because I wasn't sure when I first thought of the story, I wasn't sure if he would kind of use the larger mirror in the story to be his kind of way of transforming to the dream, or if it would be the camera. But as I did more research into it, the camera kind of took on a life of its own. And then that kind of put me in the kind of troubling piece of, all right, if this is going to make sense, how does he wind up with this possessed camera? And so I kind of had to develop a bit of a chain of custody for how this camera would have gotten, how a Kodak camera would have wound up in London that time before there was production, and how it would have wound up in his uncle's hand and ultimately wound up in America. And so I did research on a lot of people for the time period, and there's a reference in there where he's talking about what he heard his uncle say about the history of the camera. And he said all he knew is that it went from one franc to another franc. And then his uncle got it from the other Frank. Well, the two Franks are real people. So there was a Frank Brunel who actually designed that camera, was an Eastman Kodak chemist, and he was working on this camera. And one of the things that he had trouble with was in real life was how do you make this film so you don't have to develop it the way that with the big flash cameras, and how do you have like an actual film? So look to see, well, okay, now I know where the camera would be born, basically, but who would then take this and kind of add this supernatural quality to it? Well, one of Aleister Crowley's disciples, Frank Bennett, was an Australian chemist living in London the same time period that would be. So in my mind, my connection would be is that he approached, here you have Frank Brunel in America, has a camera. There's a chemist where he's looking for him to design a film who also has an occult background, and that would be kind of the logical chain of custody for how it would kind of go from your normal camera to coming being possessed by someone with an occult background. And then ultimately reaches his uncle, who has his own kind of dark and sinister background.
Yeah, I don't even want to know what's in your mind. Like seriously. Um, So, okay, in reading the book, I honestly thought the mirror was going to be the bad guy at the very beginning. I thought the mirror, so the can I mean, it's cool that you said that you weren't sure how it was going to go because at first I thought, "Oh, here we go. We're going to get in
Yeah.
with this mirror." So, what was the nugget of inspiration that started Wilson?
So it actually started with a conversation with a real person. And I I spent 23 years in the military, and you meet all kinds of people as you kind of do your travels in the military. And on one deployment, I was talking to a guy, and he told me that he does, oh, you know what, I'm home, I do amateur photography. And then we started talking about it. He says, well, I have a special talent. And I'm like, well, which is always a concerning thing, you know, you never know where that conversation is going to go. And he says, I could look at people and I could just see what they're really supposed to be. And he says, you see that guy over there? When I look at him, I picture him as an 1800s Mexican cannoneer in the full suit and stuff. And so you see that person there? I picture them as like a baker in like Italy in the 19th century. And so I'm like, wow, that's kind of really weird. And he was an odd guy, but the more I thought about it, it's like, wow, you know, let's say you had a camera that could kind of look and see not just how you picture they would be, but how those people wanted to picture themselves. You know, because everybody has, you know, especially this age of social media, people alter their pictures to look a certain way to create the image that they want. Well, yeah, obviously in the 1940s, you couldn't do that. So in their mind, you know, each of the people pictured the one person obviously pictured being the sheriff of his town, the other woman pictured being younger with like a Clark Gable type movie star, and he had the ability to kind of transform into those dreamscapes.
So, okay, so this is a question I'm going to try and not as it goes. And there is, and I haven't read your other books either, so that will be a question maybe that can go both ways. This one has that Native American folklore part in it. Do your other books have that too? And then how did you decide to blend that? How did you decide? Like, where did you decide? I'm going to put that in there. Is it because of where it takes place?
And because of where it takes place, and I was looking to, well, you know, originally the character of Hamish was someone I had conceptualized in one of my first stories that I ever had published, Among the Wolves. And in that story, he was kind of a British carnival person that shows up in the midst of World War II. And he wasn't a sinister kind of character. And kind of in my head, I envision picturing him as he kind of goes down a darker and darker road. And so Hamish would have been his second incarnation, a little bit further down into moving into a little darker path and ultimately leading to a much darker one. But then I realized after time that they were really two separate characters and they didn't mesh well. And so now at Hamish, and I wanted to feel like, well, okay, well, what is really he obviously knows what's going on. He's got these collection of people that he's gone there. And I tried to just really look to see what would make sense. What would make sense? And part of it was like what makes sense in Dahlia's backstory. And then once I kind of figured out what her kind of origin was, I said, well, what would make sense as being a companion piece with that? And ultimately, the location was kind of geared towards after I had that piece of it, what part. It was always going to be in the Dust Bowl, but where they were kind of traveling to became that Native American piece seemed to coincide very well with that. It just kind of was not planned. I'm definitely a pantser, not a planner when it comes to writing. And that's because as I research things, I'm like, hey, you know, this would make a lot of sense if I incorporate it this way. And then that just kind of, as I pull that string, it leads to something else. And the story takes on a much different texture than my initial concept.
So, atmosphere, primal fear, and moral ambiguity. Which of those three things do you enjoy writing about the most, like, or is the easiest or the hardest? Like,
You know, one of the things that I've found that I've enjoyed in this book, in my werewolf duology, Prey Upon the Lambs and Desolation of Hunters, I enjoy writing the bad guys. Part of it is because I feel that the more you flesh them out, the more the payoff is when they kind of get their just desserts. And it's you can really like writing sinister is really enjoyable. And I think that the more sinister you make the character and the more believable you make the character, the more that primal fear really kind of resonates. You know, because now you've kind of worn their skin for a little bit. You understand who they are. You understand their, especially in Wilson's case, he has this tremendous ego based upon his kind of Jekyll and Hyde type transformation that he says to himself several times. He thinks he's a god, you know,
mhm.
and so what he never envisions is something more terrifying than him that's out there. And that's one of those things that would be to something that feels it's all powerful, that feels that it's unstoppable, that there's probably nothing more terrifying than that helpless feeling that his victims, that he revels so much in his victims, is to have that turned upon them and for them to feel helpless. And I mean, his ultimate end is not much more helpless you can get than he wound up at the end.
Yeah. Um, So, have you ever written anything that you were actually scared of and you said, "Oh, hot diggity dog, that was scary."
uh, you know, I think the scarier part one of the things that resonates through all my stories is that the monster itself is usually not the bad guy, or usually not the worst part of the story, I should say. There's some of them are definitely. I think I've got a book coming out later this year from Crystal Lake Publishing called He Was Done Evil, and I think the monster in that story is probably the scariest that I've written. And again, I mean, he's not necessarily evil, but he's definitely, I would say, the scarier one. One of the things that I think is common in all the stories I've written is that the people in the stories are almost worse than the monsters. And so the monsters themselves may be very terrifying, but it doesn't really scare me, I think, as much as some of the evil that's inhabited in some of the characters themselves. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm literally making notes as I'm doing this because since I haven't written my review yet, and I didn't want to write it until we did this because I want like I messed up so much and I thought that I had it. But but it also makes me want to read something else of yours so that I can get a feel for where we're going with it. And it's kind of the fun part of finding a new author. For me, is like trying to understand their author's voice and like their way of thinking and how they go. That's why I like going to events like VoucherCon, or I
Yeah.
want to go to Scares That Care,
Yeah.
Williamsburg this year. I want to, so I it just, it's, you learn, it makes it easier for me to review
Yeah.
if
That
I
makes sense.
understand.
Yeah.
Um, do you like hearing your reviewers come and say, "What happened? I don't understand."
I think some of the best advice I've gotten throughout my writing career has come from my reviewers, more so than from anyone else. And I think in my first novel, the Seven Dents of Prince Vlad, one of the one of the best, well, I don't know if it's the best review, but one of the most critical comments I received back was that, I liked the story, but I never felt that they were really in any jeopardy, and it was a mistake I think I made in a debut novels. I really enjoyed the characters. I didn't want bad things to happen to characters that I enjoyed, and you kind of are protective of them. And while it made sense in that particular story, I thought that was a great comment that like you want to feel that anything could happen at any time and no character is particularly safe. I think obviously when you watch like shows like Game of Thrones, the fact that like, wow, they just can't believe they just killed that character, that adds a certain level of suspense to every episode, to every scene, to everything you do. And so I took that advice, that criticism, said, that's a great point. And so even there's some characters that really, really killed me to kill them off and do bad things. You have to do that to kind of keep it shocking to the reader and keep the story not predictable and not be like, okay, everyone's going to happy ending, Frodo's going to destroy the ring and the world is going to be a better place. And a lot of my stories don't necessarily have, not that they always end as grim as say Wilson did, but they definitely don't. Not everything wraps up in a nice, neat bow. And characters you want to have a happy ending don't always get a happy ending because that's kind of real life. The things you want to turn out a certain way don't. And I think that adds a certain layer of realism that, wow, you feel really invested in this character, and it's gut wrenching. It's gut wrenching to kill a character that you like, but it's really necessary for the story.
Which character did you hate killing the most?
They're in Prey Upon the Lambs and Desolation of Hunters in the second book. And I've gotten hate mail about like, how could you have done this? How could you have killed him? And there's some characters that I think it made sense for the gravity of the story and for the logical progression of the story for certain characters to not make it to the end of the story and not get a happy ending at it. And that was probably the one because that started as a short story where I kind of pictured like, oh, this little like werewolf. It takes place in a Russian village at the turn of the century, right before the fall of the Tsar. And it was a very neat, compact little short story. I said, wow, I feel like there's more to this. And so I said, you know what? I was writing on Medium at the time. I said, maybe I'll put this out as four separate like installments. And then I kind of put that together. I said, it still feels like there's too many holes, too much missing that's there. And so ultimately wound up being a two-volume duology. But over the course of that, there's some characters that I thought would just kind of come and go through the story, really became very central to the tale and into the emotional part of it. And as you become emotionally attached to them, to kind of rip them out of the story is adds levity to the everything that goes on.
So, okay, let me ask it like this. For a reader, so for a reader coming in new to you, so I've just picked up Wilson. Tell me what I should read next, or what you're most proud of, or like this is gonna
So
scare Jesus, or like.
I think one of the best places to start is with short stories. I've got a collection of short stories. They come when you sleep, and those are, it's a much more disciplined piece to write it in a smaller context, And I touched upon a lot of different themes, but I think as you read the short stories, there's a very common thread that runs through my style of writing and how I view it. Really, it's, growing up, I liked fantasy books and I wanted to, that's, you want to go on the great adventure and things. And like I said, I spent over 20 years in the military, traveled the world, did multiple deployments. And then you realize that like these adventures are not really the way you think they're going to be. And there's not the hero of the tale and the way things happen are not really the way that they are. And not that it made me jaded, but it definitely gave me a different look towards humanity overall. And I think that definitely plays in the story that I've got a much more cynical look at humankind. There's a lot of things where, if you look at folk horror, which I think a lot of my stuff falls into, it's typically someone is being chased by some creature that lives in the woods or they've trespassed. But the key part is they've trespassed onto that land.
Mhm.
That creature, very rarely does that creature out of just sheer malice do something. We're the interloper. And we've built our world on top of theirs. And sometimes there's a comeuppance to that. Sometimes, there's just like cracks in the cement, things will seep through and there's a bill to be paid. And so I think that's pretty common in my writing. And I think you see it in the short stories that's there that, like I said, and I've said it before and I've talked about my werewolf duology is that, when it's just a wolf, it's just an animal. It's deadly, it's scary, it's a predator. There's not that aspect of evil until you incorporate the human into the werewolf. And at that point, you get the real malice and the real possibility for evil, where you don't get that in an animal in and of itself. And I think that's a very common in a lot of the stories that I write.
So we have got horror, dark fantasy. We've got werewolves, vampires. We've we've got this, folklore, all of these little pieces, and then you've got short stories, and you've got a duology. What do you find the most challenging?
Well, one of the things I try and do is I try and not write the same type of story twice, right? I have my list of things I want to write. I want to write some Western horror. I want to write some science fiction horror. A, I don't want to write multiple werewolf stories. There's certain things, and in my werewolf story in Prey Upon the Lambs, I did a lot of research into before I wrote something that is such a common trope. I looked to say like, well, what do I add that's different than just a good story? There's such a large pantheon of great werewolf stories. And so I did a lot of research into scientifically like metamorphosis and creating how the creature transforms and what happens in the duality of spirit that's in there and how the wolf and the person interact internally before that's there. So and then from that point, my mom, that was one of the first books my mom read of mine that she liked. And she's like, I want you to write more of this story. And I said, no, I want to move on to something different. So I want to move to a different time period, a different type creature, a different type horror, a ghost horror, and then a more of a cryptid type horror. So I want to kind of move from each one so as not to get too comfortable in one particular subgenre of horror. I want to constantly challenge myself to write in a different format and to write in a different kind of subgenre of overall.
I like, especially in horror, I love when you've got a good short story or in an anthology and there is that common thread. Just like you said, it's that discipline. And I like knowing that it's as few words as possible to pass that
Mhm.
story on. And I know that it's challenging for the author to get it, but it's like I know that I need to pay attention to every single word.
Yeah,
There,
yeah,
every word counts when it's like that. I love them.
yeah. And your story has to be with a short story, the storytelling has to be so concise. You can't ramble, you can't if it doesn't advance the story, it shouldn't be in the story. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's where you have the ability when you write a novel to kind of expand out and add in some extra texture and things like that. Like in Wilson, there's a lot of little side pieces that add to the overall story. When I first wrote Wilson as a short story, it was maybe one fifth the length that it ultimately wound up being as a short story, but expanding it out gave me the ability to kind of pull all those different strings and add different texture and explain more about the backstory and explain more about like ultimately not just a oh this is what happens at the end, but to give Dahlia a very big, a much larger backstory and understanding of what transpired.
Could Wilson go on? Could there be, I mean, like when the way that it ended for me, I was like, oh, I can see where this could go.
So I did initially think of, like I said, for Hamish's carnival to continue on and with other things to potentially occur in the carnival, but I just haven't necessarily thought of the direction to go with. Now, I do like to have in each of my stories, there's a little tidbit in every one of them that links to something in another
Oh,
story.
cool.
And it's if you didn't read the other story, it doesn't take anything away from the story, but a lot of people catch like, oh, I see what you did there. That person, I know, there's a reference to this, a reference to that to show that this kind of takes place in like a shared world altogether. And so I do some of that that does connect the stories together. And some characters or reference characters definitely come up in various places.
We love Easter eggs. I know I do. A lot of readers that I read with, we love them. I mean, it's like Stephen King. There are all these little pieces come in. You may not have seen it for 4 books, but you're going to see it again.
Yeah, and that's one of the things when I write, I like to put in, like I said, there's a lot of historical information that's in there that some people you could, if you gloss over it, like the picture album and things like that, if you don't pick up on what it is, doesn't take away from the story. If you do pick up on what it is, it's people will be like, "Wow, I know what he's referencing here. I know what he's
Yeah.
referencing there." Or if it's something that's a reference to another book, if you didn't read the other book, it won't take it away. But if you did read it, it's like, that's kind of cool. So I try to interweave it enough so that it's almost like an added benefit. And if it's, but it does take away if you don't know it. So you're not like, wait, I don't understand who this person is or why that happened or what they're referencing. And that's my own kind of fun of like putting that in there and seeing how this connects. And
Yeah. Is there a trope within the horror that makes you want to poke yourself in the eye?
hey, that's a minefield question because I'm going to say it, and then one of my friends is going to call and be like, "I write that. What do you mean? You said you liked my book." Um, no, I mean I think that there's so many tropes out there that you could do something unique with every single one of them. And that's really the key. There's I think Stephen Graham Jones does a great job. He definitely sits in the slasher universe for his books, but he constantly does in like I was a teenage slasher, does so much new with the genre, both by poking fun at it and by kind of digging into it that you don't feel, even though he uses all the tropes that are there and kind of pokes fun at it, it doesn't feel stale. It doesn't feel anything like that. So I think that for every trope that's out there, there's some really good writers that do it. There's certain things. I will say time travel is the one thing that I can't stand personally. I don't like to
Yeah.
watch it. I don't like to read it. I always find there's loopholes, but there's some great time travel stories and things like that out there. So if there's any kind of trope, I was just on this conversation the other night because I watched The Dark on Netflix, the 3 seasons of it. And at the end, I was like, this is why I don't watch time travel. This is why nothing makes sense at the end of the day. You're like, wait, how could this have happened there? And but that's probably the one trope that I refuse to touch with a 10-foot pole.
Do you find it harder to watch TV and things like that? In now that you're as well into this author life, that because you can see the plot holes, you're like, well, that wouldn't happen.
Well, that's an excellent point. I do watch less now than I did before I was writing more. And I spend a lot of time reading, a lot of time with audiobooks. I try not to watch as much horror as I used to watch. And I mean, there's certain things that come out that I'm like, I really want to see this movie. This seems really unique. And because you don't want to kind of put those thoughts in the back of your head. It's very visual, it's very visceral. And so, I grew up on John Carpenter horror. I grew up on certain horror that kind of shaped my psyche for how I view kind of
Mhm.
the horoscope. And so I don't watch as much as I used to because now that I'm writing, I don't want any of that to kind of creep in. And I want it to be original. I want it to be fresh. I don't want it to be like, huh, because you do watch movies sometimes and they're like, I would have done this differently or I would have done that differently. And I don't want that to kind of seep into stories. I want my stuff to feel pretty fresh and original.
Has your military background crept into any of this yet?
Not as much. There's a little more in He Was Done Evil because it takes place during World War One. So there's some overall knowledge of stuff in It Pierces, which comes out in September. It takes place with four Marine veterans, and so there's some aspects of it. I think the part that comes the most that creeps into my writing from my military experience is the interactions you have when you're on a deployment. You're very isolated and stuff, and the conversations you have with your friends in the downtime feel like the most important conversations you've ever had over the most inane topics. And I try to incorporate some of those types of conversations of what realistically people would have in those type situations. And for example, like, you could sit there and I remember two guys arguing as if they were arguing about like the nature of the universe, whether an actor should be allowed to play two different superheroes and two different. If you're in a Marvel movie, you shouldn't be in a DC movie because you're in the Marvel movie. And they argued as if they were arguing like creation versus evolution. And it's because, and to try and capture those kinds of interpersonal moments and infuse that into the stories is probably the one thing I try and pull from my career of in those moments what a realistic conversation would sound like, what people would really talk about, what they would say, how they would react, and how those friendships and bonds would form. I think tries to are things I try and incorporate more so than the actual military aspect. It's those relationships I've experienced and witnessed.
When did you know, like, when was the moment that I am a writer? I've done this.
Maybe I'm still waiting for that. It's funny when we drove cross country from Tampa to the Seattle area here, and as we were coming cross country, we were talking about that history is written by the victors. I forgot what started the conversation, but so much of history is based upon the people that won wrote it. And we had a side conversation about, look at like Dracula, right? Obviously Dracula is a fictional story, but Dracula would be relayed, theoretically to Bram Stoker by Van Helsing and the surviving members of the party, which doesn't mean that it's necessarily the true story, right? It could have, but that's just a story Van Helsing wanted told, right? And so the Seven Deaths of Prince Vlad is a reimagining of the Dracula tale from the perspective of Dracula with Van Helsing as the antagonist, not the protagonist. Van Helsing and the whole uh, group of them as the evildoers, and Vlad and his cohorts as more the victims than anything else. And
I'm totally gonna read this now. I'm like, "Hmm."
yeah. But that was kind of we talked about it. It was kind of our I mean hours of car driving. We kind of talked to the story, what would happen, where they would do, and what it would look like. And I decided to, one of the things we talked about as we came cross country is we want to do when we get out here, all the things we've said, everything that's kind of on our bucket list of things to do. And I've always said I've wanted to write. And so we got here, and my wife said, "Well, that's what you should write. You should write that. We talked about this for nonstop for weeks. Put it down on paper." And so I first wrote it as kind of a like an ode to her, to like, hey, look, I did it. We did it there, and I put it out on Amazon, and people started to read it and like it, and I was like, wow, this is kind of crazy. And and then Anuci Press came and picked it up and said, hey, would you be interested in having this reissued as an Anuci Press item? And from there, it kind of I said, hey, maybe people are interested in what I have to write, not just you know me. And
Yeah,
yeah.
that's so. How many trips to Romania did you get out of the
Uh,
to write the story?
So I did. I spent a lot of time in Sibiu, Romania, and which is in Transylvania, which is where my wife is from. She's
Oh,
from
that's
a small
cool.
town. Yeah, so we do go to Vlad country fairly often, at least once a year.
Oh, that makes it even better. That gives you like a personal element. And I think it's really
Yeah.
cool that you have such a great support system. that encourages you to. I've only had one other author that I've read whose wife actually said, "No, this you've got to do this."
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
really, I mean, I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I've wanted to do it my whole life. Growing up, you hear they no, writing is not a profession. That's something you do for fun and all that. So it's never something I really explored. But she pushed me. She really pushed me into like, hey, this is really do it for yourself and for no one else. Don't do it for other people to read it. Do it because you've always wanted to write a book and you've got a good story. You should be able to hold it in your hands and look at it and read it. And I was like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And I did it kind of as a gift for her, and it took off and is now 8 books later, and with the ninth and 10th coming out this year.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So tell me your top three authors.
Ah, so I'm a huge David Barnett fan. Everything in his Withered Hill universe, I read. I like a lot of folk horror. Probably the biggest influence on me has been Gerald Brom. I grew up on his artwork, and then once he started to write, the Child Thief I thought was incredible. And he also writes from a very contrarian point of view that usually like in Slewfoot, and the monster is not necessarily the worst person in the story. And I that really always resonated with me. I feel that he's kind of carved out. One of the things when you first start writing that's probably the most difficult is you start writing, you realize, wow, I don't sound like Stephen Graham Jones. I don't sound like Paul Tremblay. I don't sound like Stephen King. You start thinking like, so maybe this isn't good, right? It doesn't sound like anything that I read. And so you think to yourself like, all right, well, maybe it's just not good writing. When I read Gerald Brom, and he's really carved out such a unique universe for himself. You pick up a book, if you don't see the cover, I could read it and I'd be like, I know this is one of Brom's books from his style of writing, his style of storytelling, and that kind of really gave me the push I needed to be like, you know what? I don't want my voice to sound like anyone else that's out there. I want to kind of have my own voice in the space where someone picks up and like, wow, this sounds just like Jack Finn. More so than like, huh, is this person or that person? And once I kind of had that epiphany, it was very liberating because then you're like, all right, this sounds like me. And I feel like now when I write, I feel very comfortable in my own skin and my own voice, and that has enabled me to write.
That's that contrarian, that's kind, and I don't say a brand new word, but it is something like in horror that is like you're right. Like that's not Stephen Graham Jones. That's not, I mean, it is, it's definitely a different voice that comes through when
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest challenge I think for people when they first start to write. It was certainly for me because you grow up reading all these people and you love their books, right? And you want to write something like that. You're like, wow, you read Peter Straub, you read Stephen King, you read all these, and you're like, wow, I love this book. And so when you write, you want to have, in your mind, you're picturing these stories that really brought you into horror, that really got you loving the genre. And to write something that doesn't sound like that seems so off kilter. But then you realize, like, no, that's what adds to the texture, to this whole fabric of the horror genre, is to pick up and sound completely differently. And like I said, and when I picked up Brom's book, I'm like, man, this is different than any other horror book I've read. It's brilliant. And I'm like, that's what I want. That was the goal I set for myself when I started to write, was to not sound like anything that I've read.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the reasons that I try not to watch as much horror as I used to watch, because I don't want to sound like anything I've watched. And but it's liberating once you kind of like, hey, I'm going to sound like me, and eventually you do find your audience of people that like, hey, I like
Yeah.
this voice.
Yeah, that is really cool. I mean, it's neat that you said, we call that at my house. We say, like it, lump it, suck a big toe.
I
So
like it.
you don't like it, too bad.
I like it.
Um, do you ever, when reading, do you ever dip out of like the horror, thriller, fantasy? Like, do you ever like say, well, here's a rom-com, let's read it?
No, I do read a lot of historical fiction,
Mhm.
and so, or historical nonfiction rather. And so sometimes I'll do like a palate cleanse, and I'll shift into some. But then the problem is, I'll listen to this like history piece, and I'll think like, huh, what would be a great horror story in this time period? And then I've gone from like I should do something other, read something other than horror. So I'll read about a shipwreck or something like that, or some kind of historical event, And I think, huh, if there were zombies there, though, that would be totally really interesting. And so it's kind of ingrained in there now. So it's I try the palate cleanse, it just doesn't work so well.
Does your wife ever say, "Should I be worried?"
Not to me, not to me at least. I don't know. She may say when she calls home and talks to her mom. She's like, I don't know, he's writing another one of those horror books. I don't know.
It's so funny. So what do you do when you get into a block? Like, do you get writer's blocks? Like, do you get stuck? And
Yeah.
then because where you're not a planner and you just kind of let it happen, and then you pull this string and pull this string. So how do you get out of that?
So sometimes I'll do research. There's a lot of advice that people always give on. I see a lot to writers that you should be writing X number of words per day. You should be writing. I think as long as you're doing something for your craft, whether you're doing research, whether you're doing whether you're just writing a short story, stepping away from it, whether you're putting some social media out, you want to keep engaged creatively, but you can't force yourself to write, right? That puts it, one, it makes it unenjoyable, and two, it doesn't flow the same way as you do it. And there's definitely times where I'll step away and I'll be like, all right, I need to just maybe work on a short story or read something different, or I'll do that palate cleanse. And I feel that like once you take that pressure off and you kind of like let your brain kind of like breathe for a moment, the story comes back and flows. I do find it's harder with longer stories. Like when I read a full length novel, which takes significantly longer than writing something short, that like you get through that, and as you get other great ideas that you really get excited to jump into, you're like, all right, well, I have to finish this first before I can move on to this next one. That's more of a challenge, I think, than the writer's block, because I get distracted by another thought of like, I really want to write this. And so when I do get those moments, I'll write down some notes. Do some research for the other story, and then I'll come back with a fresh mind.
So you have more than one thing going at a time.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I could have
I've got
picked
a
that one out.
I've got a whole book of different things and research I've got behind me. There's a whole cabinet of books that are there for other stories to research and pull some historical facts from and stuff.
Well, that was kind of my next question is how, because you do like history so much and you do like research so much, how do you keep track of these ideas, like these tabs that are open?
Sometimes I wonder that if I'm like running out of RAM up there, like,
Yeah,
man,
yeah.
I forget where something is, and I'm like, maybe I need to write more because I'm using up all this space, like holding these ideas down. Yeah, sometimes you forget about something that you had a pretty good like surge moment on. And then when you go through, that's why I like to keep a detailed notebook of the thoughts that I had about it. I come back to like, that's right, this was, and then I'll kind of go down that path a little bit more, and then I'll go back to whatever I was working on beforehand. But yeah, I do have a book of like all kinds of half-baked ideas that will hopefully become fully baked in the not too distant future.
Do you, oh, let me ask you this. Are you going anywhere, like to any of these big events that are coming up?
So I'll be at StokerCon, and I'll be at Massacre on the Mountain in September, which is over at the Timberline, was the outside shots for the original Shining. That's there.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. And then we have people ask us, are there places where they can buy that are local to you where they can get a signed book? Do you have bookstores or a resource that can do that?
Yeah, there are some of the local ones here. I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and yeah, I have to start. That's one of the things I want to do in terms of from business model. Start selling more signed books from my website itself, from therealjackfinn.com.
Oh,
Right
so
now,
we can get on the website and do it that way.
yeah, if someone reaches out to me, I'd be more than happy to send it. But yeah, I do have to kind of have a little more formalized process for doing so.
So tell us now, Wilson's coming out that next month, right? Or next week?
Next week, February
Next
10th.
week. Sweet. Oh yeah, because my birthday's the 11th. I knew that. And I kept on thinking that. Okay, so Wilson's coming out on the 10th. And then what's for the rest of the year for you?
I've got a short story in the With Teeth and anthology that also comes out on the 10th. That came out from Radical Publishing. In September 8th will be It Pierces, which is a folk horror that takes place up in the Adirondacks. And then He Was An Evil is coming out, and I just started the edits with Crystal Lake Publishing today, as a matter of fact. So I don't have a release date; it'll be sometime this year. And the second book of my Book of Alice duology will come out this year from Edgeweaver Books too, which is a reimagining of Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan against the backdrop of The King in Yellow. So
I don't even know what to say about this. Like, really, do you sleep?
I don't sleep a lot, no.
No, no, like I feel like there's a hamster wheel. It's going so fast right now. It's wearing me out. That's hilarious. I don't know how you keep all of that straight. Like I mean, it's just so many things, so many irons in the fire, I guess. So
Yeah.
this is kind of we'll probably end up having to edit this one out. But so Appalachian horror
Hmm.
is huge right now. And I don't know if it's just that it's red flagging me where I live, you know, in Kentucky, and everybody thinks, I think people don't really realize how Appalachian really goes, like from Pennsylvania. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yep.
anyway, do you ever think you'll do, because there's some scary stuff here. Like, we have the tales, and I didn't hear you
Yeah.
mention that.
I do have notes in my book for in Appalachian horror dealing with Irish travelers.
Oh,
So I do
hmm.
have I've got a book behind me on Irish travelers as well. So it's
So Appalachian horror with Irish travelers.
hmm.
Okay. That's like eating sushi at the Golden Corral or something. I can't even put those two things together. Like, I don't know. We'll just have to go with it. That's cool though. I'm excited to read that one too.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you came on here. I'm glad to get to talk to you. I'm glad to get to pick your brain. Now I can write my review for Wilson because I have like I'm like in a 3D review mode now because I've got to do this. So but I really do look forward to reading some more, and hopefully we'll get you back on here too. That'd be cool.
Absolutely. I'd love to. I'd love to.
All right.